My guest today is the Right Honourable Jeremy Corbyn, member of the UK Parliament, until very recently leader of the opposition, leader of the Labour Party in the UK. And in this first part of a two-part series, I'm going to ask him the big question. What does this moment of COVID tell us about the future of politics?
The corona crisis has underlined inequality around the world. The World Health Organization gave warnings of this novel virus, of the dangers of an epidemic, and then a declaration of a pandemic, all in fairly short order in January of this year. Some governments responded very quickly and very responsibly, and as a result have come out of the corona crisis much better than anybody else. I'm thinking South Korea, I'm thinking New Zealand, and Denmark, and one or two other countries. Others either chose to delay or ignore it, or just demonstrate they weren't prepared to do very much about it. And the result of that has been that there's been a massive discrepancy in death rates, even in parts of the world with relatively good health systems, such as most of Western Europe. But it's also shown the levels of inequality around the world. The levels of inequality and lack of access to any health care for many people in India, for many people in the United States, and for many people in Brazil and other countries. It's also exposed the way in which many of the world's aid agencies, the World Bank, the G7, and the International Monetary Fund, have not properly funded healthcare strategies in most countries. So on the health side of things, it's exposed a lot of that.
What do you think are the big political lessons that this moment of COVID should teach us?
But what it's done is exposed globally how vulnerable we are to a novel virus. Ebola is obviously a danger and has been addressed and is being addressed, but nevertheless is still around. COVID-19, there isn't yet a defined vaccine to deal with it, although one may be developed, but other viri are going to come along. It will mutate into other viri. And so, as Bernie Sanders so eloquently put it, we are as healthy as the ill health of our next door neighbour. And so I think the message has to be one of hope for universal health care. But the other side of it is that all governments have now had to spend a great deal of money in financing a lockdown. But it's also exposed in Western Europe the numbers of people that are rough sleeping homeless, the numbers of refugees that don't have access to public funds, exposed the danger to refugees living in Libya, living in Lebanon, living in Jordan, or Rohingya people living in Bangladesh. And it's exposed the grotesque levels of inequality in many of the larger countries of the world. I'm thinking of what's been happening in India with many landless people who were day labourers getting very little help and support. So it's exposed all of that. So if governments in particularly the West can spend money to maintain services during a corona crisis, they can do it at all times.
And what would you say are the most important political questions for our post-COVID world?
The big turning point now is the economic direction we go. After the financial crisis of 2008 to 9, basically the Western economies bailed out the banking system, slashed public expenditure for the most needy, and increased taxes for the middle income earners. The end of a decade of austerity, there was greater levels of inequality and poverty than there were at the start of them. Even so far in the corona crisis, there's been a growth of inequality in the societies where you would have thought we would have moved in the opposite direction. So the debate now is, what direction do we go in? Do we all demand of our governments investment in health, in social care, in environmentally sustainable jobs, and in the case of the USA, a Green New Deal, in the case of, we call it, a Green Industrial Revolution, or do we go back to business as it was before?
The question I ask everyone, what are your biggest hopes? What would you wish for?
My hope is that that sense of community that has come through dealing with the corona crisis, that sense that the public as a whole can protect the most vulnerable, and that we could have a much greener, cleaner world and less inequality. Because death rates are highest amongst the poorest, life expectancy is lowest amongst the poorest, and the likelihood of being susceptible to severe corona is much greater amongst poorer people, and poor older people have been dying in their tens of thousands around the world. And those leaders that have sought to ignore or downplay or even ridicule the dangers of corona. I'm thinking here of what's been happening in Brazil. I'm thinking with what's been happening in the USA. It's very, very serious indeed. So I hope we come out of this with a collective approach to the future, a collective approach that, irrespective of what we think of our neighbours, they're just as vulnerable as we are.